The door blew inward before the latch failed. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough that the wood flexed and the iron latch bar jumped in its bracket with a hard metallic snap. The wind didn't howl. It pressed. A steady shove from the north that had been building since dusk, and now leaned on the cabin like a man testing a fence post. Elias Rourke was halfway through setting the last roof brace when it happened. He froze on the ladder, one boot hooked over the rung, hammer still in his hand. The lantern hanging from the center beam swung once, slow, casting the inside walls in a shifting ring of light. 8 walls. 8 angles, catching and breaking the wind instead of taking it full on. He listened. Outside, the other cabins along Bitter Creek were already answering the storm. When he could hear it in the distance, the long groan of flat walls taking the wind head-on, boards rattling, loose shingles slapping like torn canvas. One of them cracked sharp enough to carry across the flats. His didn't. The wind slid along the first wall, struck the next at an angle, lost force, shifted again. It never found a flat run to build against. Still, the door had jumped. He climbed down. The ladder creaked under his weight, boots thudding onto the packed dirt floor. The air inside the cabin was raw. No fire yet, no heat held, just the dry cold that came in ahead of a real drop in temperature. He crossed to the door and set his hand against it. The boards were pine, rough-planed, still holding the pitch smell from when he cut them. The latch had twisted half out of its slot. Cheap iron, bought in Cheyenne, off a man who swore it would hold through a Wyoming winter. Elias pushed the door shut with his shoulder and reset the latch. It slipped again under pressure. He didn't swear, just nodded once, like he expected it. He turned, grabbed the coil of rawhide hanging from a peg, and lashed the door shut. 2 tight wraps across the inside brace, pulling it flush against the frame. The wind hit again. The door held this time, the force spreading across the lash instead of hammering one point. Better. He stepped back and took the cabin in. It still smelled new. Cut timber, raw earth, a faint note of pitch and dust. No smoke yet. No sweat soaked into the boards. No life in it, except what he'd brought in, piece by piece. 8 sides. Each wall the same length. Each angle cut by hand with a saw that had started to dull halfway through the build. Men had ridden out from Bitter Creek 3 times to look at it. Not to help. To laugh. "Can't square a corner, Rourke," one of them had called out, sitting easy in his saddle like the whole thing was a show. "Wind'll walk right through that mess," another said. "Too many seams. Too many weak points." Elias had kept cutting. Now the wind was here to settle it. He moved to the stove. It sat dead center, set on a flat stone base he'd hauled from the creek bed. Not much to look at. Cast iron belly, short legs, a narrow firebox that forced him to split wood smaller than he liked. But it held heat if you fed it right. He crouched, opened the door, and laid in kindling. Thin splits first. Dry. He'd kept them inside for a week, so they'd burn fast and hot. Then 2 thicker pieces on top, spaced so the air could move between them. He struck the match against the stove lip. Flame caught. He didn't rush it. Let the small fire build its own draw. Watched the smoke hesitate at the flue before lifting. The pipe ran straight up through the roof. No bends. Less chance for choke. More pull if the wind didn't fight it. The draft took. Good. He added 1 more piece and shut the door, leaving the damper half open. The stove began its low ticking as the iron warmed. Behind him, the wind pressed again. Harder now. The walls answered with a dull thud, not a rattle. The angles broke the force before it could run. Elias could feel it, how the pressure shifted instead of holding. It moved around him, not through him. That was the idea. He had seen it once, years back, wood on a trapper's shelter up near the Wind River range. Not square, not round, something between. The man who built it said the wind didn't know where to settle. Elias had carried that idea with him all the way to Bitter Creek. Now it had to prove itself. A crack split the air outside. Closer this time, not his. He stepped to the window, just a cut opening with a hinged board, and lifted it a fraction. The night was white with blown snow, not falling, moving sideways in a constant sheet. Through it, he could see lantern light from the nearest neighbor's place, Harlan Pike's cabin. Square. Built fast in late summer with green-cut timber that had already started to warp. The light inside Pike's place jerked wildly. Then the roofline shifted. Not much. Just a sag at one corner where the wind had found its hold. Elias watched it for a long second, then shut the window. He knew what came next. Once a flat wall starts to give, the wind keeps working that spot. Boards loosen, nails pull, heat bleeds out. Cold pours in, and men inside start burning wood faster than they should, trying to fight a problem that isn't about fire. He turned back to his own cabin. The stove was taking hold now. Heat pushing out in a slow circle, still cold at the edges, but changing. He walked the perimeter, hand on each seam, every joint packed tight with clay and ash. Not pretty. Some of it already cracking where the wood had shrunk, but the gaps were small, easy to choke off. No long runs for air to push through. He stopped at one seam where the wind found a thread of entry. He could feel it. Thin. Sharp cutting across his knuckles, but he grabbed a strip of wool scrap from his pack, twisted it tight, and drove it into the gap with the back of his knife. Packed it deep. Sealed it. The draft stopped. He moved on. Around the cabin. 8 walls. 8 checks. By the time he finished, the stove had climbed enough that the center air no longer showed his breath. The edges still did. That would take time. Outside, Pike's cabin cracked again. Then a shout. This time, clear. Elias stood still. He could ignore it. Stay here. Feed the fire. Let his own build hold, while the others dealt with what they'd built. He looked at the door, then at the stove, then at the walls that had taken the wind and refused to bend. He grabbed his coat. No rope this time, no preparation. Just the coat, the lantern, and a length of split pine from the stack. Habit more than thought. And he kicked the lash loose and hauled the door open. The wind hit him full. For a moment, it shoved him back a step. Then it slipped past him, broken by the angles of the walls behind him. He stepped out into it and turned toward Pike's place, the lantern flame guttering low, but holding, and started across the drifted ground, knowing one thing clear in his head. If his cabin stayed warm tonight, while the others bled heat into the wind, the laughter would stop. But if it didn't, there would be no one left in Bitter Creek to laugh at anything. Elias reached Pike's cabin bent nearly double against the wind. The snow had hardened into ridges that grabbed at his boots, breaking his stride every few steps. Fine grit of ice cut across his face, working into the seams of his coat, down his collar, under the wool at his neck. And the lantern swung low in his grip, flame pulled thin and sideways, but it stayed alive. Pike's place was already failing. He saw it clear now. The north wall had bowed inward by an inch, maybe more. Not enough to drop the structure yet, but enough to break the chinking loose along the seams. The wind had found those gaps and was driving through them, stripping heat straight out of the cabin. The door hung open. That told him everything. No man leaves a door open in a blow like this unless something inside has gone wrong enough to stop thinking about the wind. Elias stepped up onto the threshold and ducked inside. The cold hit him first. Not outside cold. Worse. Outside, the air moved. Here, it sat dead and sharp, sucking heat from anything that held it. The stove in the corner smoked without drawing, but a dull orange glow choked under its own ash. The flue pipe rattled with each gust, but no pull carried the smoke up. Pike was at the far wall, shoulder braced against a warped plank, both hands gripping a crossbeam he'd tried to wedge in place. "Don't stand there," Pike barked without turning. "Get that door shut or we're done." Elias kicked it closed behind him and dropped the latch. It didn't fit clean. The frame had already shifted. "Flue's blocked," Elias said, stepping to the stove. "Know that," Pike snapped. "Climbed twice. Freezes again every hour." Elias crouched and opened the firebox. Too much wood. Burned too hard, too fast. The coals had collapsed in on themselves, choking airflow. He took the poker and broke them apart, dragging the heavier pieces forward, opening space for air to move. "Damper?" he asked. Wide open." That was wrong. Elias reached up and cut it halfway. "You're feeding the wind," he said. "Pull's too strong when it clears. Then it dies when it chokes. You're killing your own fire." Pike didn't answer. He was still fighting the wall. Elias fed in 2 narrow splits. Not big, not heavy. Enough to catch quick and rebuild heat without smothering the draft. He left the door cracked, watching the smoke hesitate, then lift. It pulled. Weak, but there. "Where's your chinking?" Elias asked, glancing at the seams. "Cracked out," Pike said. "Wall shifted. Nothing to hold it." The seams were wide, too wide for scraps alone. The wind was working through them like a blade, cutting across the room in hard, narrow streams. Elias stood. "You've got blankets?" he asked. Pike jerked his head toward a pile near the bed. Elias grabbed one, thick wool, and moved to the worst seam, the one along the bowed north wall. He folded the blanket tight and jammed it into the gap, driving it deep with his shoulder, using the warped plank itself to hold it in place. The draft dulled, not gone, but slowed. He moved to the next seam, then the next. Each one took time. Each one fought back, the wind pushing against his hands as he forced material into the gaps. His fingers went numb halfway through. He didn't stop. Behind him, the stove began to tick louder, heat building. "Your wood," Elias said, without turning. "How much left?" "Half a cord outside." "Inside?" "Not enough." That tracked. Most men stacked outside, thinking they could haul in what they needed. Not tonight. Elias turned back to the stove and shut the door fully, it adjusting the damper again until the draw steadied. Not too strong. Not too weak. A slow, constant pull that would keep the fire alive without eating through the wood. "You stay here," Elias said. "Don't let that door open again. Not for anything." Pike looked at him now. Really looked. "You walking back in this?" he said. Elias didn't answer. He picked up the lantern and headed for the door. Outside, the wind had shifted slightly west. Worse angle. It hit him sideways now, trying to turn him off his line as he stepped down from the threshold. He leaned into it and moved, counting steps in his head to keep direction when the snow wiped out all depth. 20 steps. 30. The outline of his own cabin came into view as a dark, low shape against the white. It hadn't moved. The walls still held straight. No bow, no sag. And the door lash hung loose where he'd cut it, but the frame hadn't shifted enough to matter. He got inside and shut the door fast, resetting the rawhide wraps in 2 quick pulls. The heat difference hit him immediate. Not warm, not comfortable, but stable. The air in the center of the cabin held steady, the stove pushing a controlled circle of heat that didn't bleed out along the walls. He could feel it, the way it stayed. Didn't race upward, didn't vanish into drafts. It sat. That was the thing. Square cabins leaked heat at the corners. Air pooled wrong. Warm air climbed and died at the roof, while cold air pushed in low and stayed. Here, it moved different. The angles turned the air slow, breaking the flow. No long runs, no dead pockets. Heat circled instead of escaping. He crossed to the woodpile, still high. He bent. He grabbed as much as he could carry, 6 splits under one arm, 4 under the other, and tied them tight with a strip of rawhide. Not loose carry. He needed both hands free in the wind. He took a second bundle. Smaller. Then he stopped. Looked at the stove. Looked at the walls. Measured it. He could spare this. Not more. He slung the bundles across his back, looped the rawhide across his chest, and headed out again. The second trip cost him more. The wind had teeth now. It cut harder, found the seams in his coat, worked into his sleeves. His right hand went numb halfway across, fingers stiff around the lantern handle. He switched hands, flexed the dead one against his side, kept moving. Pike's door was still shut when he reached it. Good. He kicked once and shouted. Pike opened just enough to pull him in and slammed it shut again. Elias dropped the wood by the stove. "Feed it small," he said. "Keep the draft steady. Don't chase heat. Hold it." Pike nodded once. No argument now. The wall held where Elias had packed it. The blanket bulged in the seam, but didn't move. The drafts had weakened enough that the stove's heat could build instead of vanish. "You've got 2 choices," Elias said. "Burn fast and freeze later, or burn slow and make it through." Pike looked at the stove, then at the walls, then back at Elias. "Yours holding?" he asked. Elias didn't answer right away. He thought about the seams he'd packed, the way the heat sat in the center, the way the wind slid instead of struck. "Yeah," he said. Pike let out a breath he'd been holding too long. "Figures," he muttered. "Damn 8-sided box." Elias almost smiled, almost. Keep the door shut," he said again. "I'll come back at first light." "You won't need to," Pike said. Elias paused. "Why's that?" Pike looked around his own cabin, at the bowed wall, at the packed seams, at the stove just beginning to push heat back into the room. Then he looked at Elias. "Because if yours is still standing in the morning," he said, "mine won't matter." Elias said nothing to that. He stepped back into the wind one more time and turned toward his own cabin, the lantern low, the snow driving sideways, and the knowledge settling in his bones that by sunrise, every man along Bitter Creek would know exactly which cabin held heat and which ones had been bleeding it into the dark all night. The wind quit before the light came. Not all at once. It eased its grip in stages, the hard shoves turning to long breaths, and then to nothing but a low drag across the flats. Elias woke to the absence of pressure. No boards flexing. No weight leaning on the walls. Just stillness. He lay on the narrow cot for a moment and listened. The stove ticked steady. Not hot. Not dying. Right where he left it. He swung his boots down and crossed the cabin barefoot for 2 steps before the dirt floor reminded him what the night had been. Cold, but not biting. The kind a man could work in. He opened the stove and checked the bed. Coals alive. Packed tight. He broke them once with the poker, fed 2 small splits, and shut it again with the damper set narrow. No need to waste wood now. The worst had passed. Light came thin through the shutter cracks. He unlashed the door and pulled it open. The world outside had been leveled. Drifts ran shoulder-high along the north side, packed hard where the wind had driven them. The open ground lay scoured down to a crust that shone dull in the early gray. No movement, no sound. Even Bitter Creek itself looked frozen in place, the surface skinned over in rough plates. Elias stepped out and stood there a moment, letting the cold air settle on his face. Then he looked toward the other cabins. Pike's place was still standing. That was the first thing. The north wall still bowed, but it hadn't gone. The roofline held, crooked but intact. Smoke came thin from the flue, not much, but enough. Further out, the Darnell brothers' cabin showed worse. One corner had dropped. The roof sagged along the ridgepole where the wind had found its hold and worked it through the night. No smoke there. Elias didn't wait. He pulled his coat tight and walked. The snow held him better now, crusted hard enough that his weight didn't break through as often. Each step made a dry, hollow crunch, the kind of sound that carried. Pike met him at the door before he knocked. His face was gray with cold, beard rimmed with frost, eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep. "Still here," Pike said, like he didn't quite believe it. Elias nodded once and stepped inside. The difference from the night before was clear. Still cold, but not dead cold. The kind that kills. The blanket still held in the seam. The stove sat low, but alive. A steady red under the ash. Pike had done what he was told. Fed it small. Held the draft tight. "You kept it," Elias said. Pike shrugged once. Didn't have much choice. Elias walked the wall, checked the seams. "Won't hold another night like that," he said. "Not without fixing the frame." Pike nodded. "I know." He looked at Elias then. Not the way a man looks at a neighbor. The way he looks at something he had judged wrong. "That shape of yours," Pike said. "Didn't move?" "No." "Not once?" Elias shook his head. Pike let out a slow breath and looked down at his own floor, tilted just enough now to notice in the quiet. "Darnell's didn't make it through," he said. Elias looked up. "Gone?" he asked. "Alive," Pike said, "but they ran the stove too hard, burned through near everything before midnight. By morning they were down to splinters and broken boards." That meant one thing. They'd been feeding heat into a losing fight, trying to outburn the cold, while their cabin bled it faster than they could make it. "Where are they?" Elias asked. "Over at Beck's lean-to," Pike said. "Packed in like cattle." Elias nodded once. "Stay on your fire," he said. "I'll be back." He stepped out again and turned toward the Darnell place. The damage showed clearer up close. The south corner had sunk 2 inches where the ground had shifted under the weight. Not much, but enough. The walls had twisted with it, opening seams along the north side wide enough to see through. The roof sagged where the ridge beam had taken uneven load through the night. No smoke. He stepped inside. Cold hit him hard. Everything inside had frozen still. The stove sat black and dead, iron split along one seam from overheating and cooling too fast. Ash spilled across the floor. One of the brothers had tried to feed it everything: planks, scraps, anything that would burn. Didn't matter. And the heat had gone straight out through the walls. Elias walked it once, slow. He pressed a hand against one seam. Wind had carved it wider through the night, grinding the chinking loose and carrying it off. There was no fixing that quick, not in this weather. He stepped back outside and looked at the structure. Then he turned and walked back toward his own cabin. By the time he reached it, the sun had broken low over the flats. No warmth in it, just light, enough to show every mark the night had left behind. Men began to move along Bitter Creek, doors opening, figures stepping out slow, stiff from the cold, smoke rising thin where fires had held. No smoke where they hadn't. They saw his cabin. It stood clean. No sag. No bow. No torn seams. Just 8 walls catching the light at different angles, each one throwing the wind off in a direction it couldn't use. They walked over, not all at once, one at a time. Pike first, then Beck, then one of the Darnell brothers, moving slower than the rest, face hollow from a long night. They didn't speak right away. They walked the outside, hands on the walls, pressing the joints, looking at the angles where each log met the next. Not pretty cuts, some rough, some uneven, but tight. No long seams, no flat face for the wind to lean on. Pike crouched near the base of one wall and ran his hand along the line where it met the ground. "Didn't drift up on you," he said. Elias shook his head. "Wind breaks before it stacks." That was another thing he'd guessed at more than known. Flat walls caught snow, built drifts that pressed against the structure, adding weight and sealing in cold. But these angles cut the flow. The snow slid off or settled low. Beck stood back and looked at the whole shape. "Looks wrong," he said. Elias didn't argue. "Works," he said. The Darnell brother stepped closer. "You cut all this by hand?" he asked. "Yes." "How long?" 6 weeks. The man nodded slow. Behind him, the others kept looking, not laughing now, measuring. Pike straightened up. "How much warmer?" he asked. Elias looked at him. 15 degrees, he said, maybe more near the stove. Pike let out a short breath through his nose. 15, he repeated. That was the difference between water freezing solid in the bucket and staying liquid, between a man sleeping through the night and waking every hour to feed a fire that couldn't keep up. Beck kicked at the snow near the wall. "You gonna show how you did it?" he asked. Elias looked at the cabin, at the angles, the joints. The work cut into every line of it. He thought about the nights leading up to this, the men riding out to laugh, the time it took, the extra cuts, the mistakes he'd had to fix by hand. Then he looked at Pike's bowed wall in the distance, at the Darnell place sagging into the ground. He nodded once. "I'll show it," he said. "You cut it." No one argued with that. They stood there a while longer, the cold morning settling around them, the proof of the night laid out in plain sight. No speeches, no thanks spoken out loud. Just men looking at a structure that had taken the worst the plains could give and held its heat while everything else bled it away. By afternoon, Pike had already started marking out 8 equal lengths in the snow beside his place. The Darnells followed. Elias stayed at his own cabin, feeding the stove slow. Watching the heat hold steady inside walls, the wind still couldn't figure out.